Okay, thanks for inviting me down here. As Alex said, my name is Peter Lee. My official job title, as it says there, is Head of National Accounts Coordination Branch. What that actually means is I'm responsible for the production of the second and third estimates of GDP, not the one that came out this morning. I work closely with the people who do that. And I'm responsible for balancing the three approaches to GDP, and I'll talk a little bit about that. Alex has given me some sort of indication of the kinds of things to cover, which I've tried to deal with in the slides. If you want me to go slightly off subject, I'll do my best. Obviously, I won't answer any political questions or opinion questions or questions of policy, but I'll try to deal with pretty much anything else. Okay, just to give an overview, just to give a little sort of overview of the ONS, what we do, a little bit of history, the kind of our responsibilities, and who we report to, and so forth. Probably the meat of the presentation will be talking about what the national accounts are, some of the key statistics, and what they can be used for, what they are used for, and in certain cases what they shouldn't be used for, what certain parts of them shouldn't be used for. A little bit talk about the data collection and the publication process that we go through, not just for national accounts but generally, and the Blue Book and Quarterly Round, so that's the national accounts publication cycle. A little bit of a plug to the ONS website and our customer contact centre, and as Alex said, a little bit about interpretation of published statistics where they may not necessarily seem to mesh too well together from various places. I'll send Alex the slides afterwards so that they can be circulated whenever. Okay, so overview of the ONS. It was formed 14 years ago. Merger of two other organisations, the Central Statistical Office, which was responsible for mainly economic statistics, among, not exclusively, and the Office for Population Censuses and Surveys, which, as it says, dealt with population stats mainly based partly in London, partly down in Titchfield and Hampshire, did the 10-yearly census and ran the social surveys. The business surveys were run by the CSO. At that point we had three sites in London. The main one, we had one in the Treasury building, we had one St Catherine's House, and a little bit of one in Islington. We had one in Newport, one in Southport, one in Titchfield, and a small one in Runcorn, doing various things. Southport was to do with the registration of birth, deaths, and marriages and so forth. We merged the two London offices because that was more as the hangover of the CSO-OPCS split, and they went to our main office in Drummondgate in 2000, which is coincidentally when I joined the ONS a few months later. Runcorn closed down in 2001. It was a very small office, and the work from there moved down to the Newport site. Various decisions, various reviews and so forth suggested that we should be moving more things out of London, more civil servants out of London. So between 2005 and 2010, the statistical outputs all moved out of London. Some to Titchfield, some to Newport. The economic ones tended to go to Newport, the social ones, the health stats and so forth, went down to Titchfield. Newport became the head office in around about 2007 or thereabouts. The last thing to move out was actually national accounts. Initially they weren't going to move, but decisions were taken that we were. Government passed the Statistics and Registration Service Act in 2007, which made us a non-ministerial department, specifically independent of and at arm's length from government, although we're still civil servants and so on. Previously we've been one of the Chancellor's departments, so in theory we reported through Treasury. We were already independent, we weren't under political pressure on the numbers and so forth, but this was a decision that was taken by Gordon Brown.
You still report to the Treasury?
No, we're accountable direct to Parliament. There's some vestigial ministerial responsibility which rests with the Minister for the Cabinet Office, but it had absolutely nothing to do with the statistics at all. What that meant was the Southport office, which did the registration of birth, deaths and marriages, which has to report through a minister, could no longer be part of the ONS and joined the Identity and Passport Service as soon as the Act came into force, which was March 2008 or April 2008. We then consolidated the rest of London into one building. First, the little one we had in Islington, and then we went back to Pimlico, not just over a half of one floor of a building. We used to have 3 buildings in a complex, and now we've got half of one floor in 09. So, the Stats and Registration Service Act set up the UK Statistics Authority. We're not allowed to call it UKSA because there's another organisation which has already got the trademark UKSA. I think it's the UK Shareholders Association or something. And that's chaired, as of earlier this year, by Andrew Dilnott, taking over from Sir Michael Scholar. The National Statistician, who is head of the professional stats, is Jill Matheson, and she's head of a thing called the Government Statistical Service, because we're not the only statisticians within government departments, within the civil service. There are people in the Treasury, in the MOD, DEFRA, DEC, all over the place, and they all come under this umbrella organisation called the Government Statistical Service, and they report into Jill. And we have a new Director General of the ONS as of this month. Glenn Watson, his predecessor, retired, and Glenn's taken over. He was previously in charge of the census. One of our highest profile. Just to give you an idea of size, so including the UK Stats Authority, we've got just under 1,700 in Newport. It says 1150 in Titchfield, but we also have all these field interviewers go out and run the social surveys and knock on doors. They're spread all over the country, but for admin purposes we class them as Titchfield. So over 1,100. There are 55 left in London. Partly that's people from the authority, partly we have a thing called the Methodology Consultancy Service, who provide statistical methodology advice to other government departments within London. And we also have a vestigial press office presence.
Does this mean that this authority staff is counted under ONS staff?
If you look at our publication, the Public Sector Employment Stats, where it's got a breakdown by government department, the civil service staff, it will say UK Statistics Authority, and that will include all our ONS staff, because we are in effect the executive arm of the Stats Authority. So we are separate and we're not. Andrew's very keen that we don't regard ourselves as separate, but there is definitely a divide. And we've got 6 others who are basically regional people for the Stats Authority. When I joined 12 years ago, we had something like 1,100 people in London, so big change. Okay, so what do we do? Some of our key outputs. Earlier this year, we ran last year we ran the 10-yearly census. Results are starting to be published this year. That's been going since 1801. But every time we decide to run that, there has to be an act of Parliament to say, yes, we're going to run the census. So we don't know if there's going to be one in 2021 yet. The prices, so things like the consumer prices indices, the retail price index, producer prices indices, all these kinds of things, they're all ours, although the RPI used to be done by Cabinet Office, I think, many years ago. Labour market statistics are all ours. Unemployment, employment, claimant count and the like. National accounts, I'm here to talk about. We have health statistics, some of which are funded by the Department of Health, some not. We've recently taken over crime statistics from the Home Office. They are actually currently in London, but they're going to move down to Titchfield. Hi. Another high-profile area, we have the population and migration statistics run from the Titchfield office. The regional statistics vary in their level of profile depending on various things. And we run loads of business and social surveys. One of the key function of the Newport office before the relocation from London was that's where the business surveys were run from. It was originally called the Business Statistics Office, which was part of DTI as was. And we've got a large number of people working on sending out survey forms to businesses and also to households. One of the key things we have to do is European data transmission. We have lots of legal requirements to provide data to our European equivalent, Eurostat, for a variety of reasons, some of which I'll touch on where the national accounts are concerned. But they do have a big effect on various European policies.
Is that all the data transmission government gets?
Not all of it, but the majority of it comes through us. There are some things that come from a place like Treasury and so on, but pretty much the economic data, by and large, comes from us. And we run a thing called the Interdepartmental Business Register, without going into massive detail. That's the list of all the businesses which is set as the frame for which we run all our surveys. And when we decide to run a business survey, that's where we'll get the list of respondents from. Okay, so that's sort of overview of the ONS. Talk about national accounts. So I came up with, this isn't an official definition that I've come up with, it's just a way of wording it. Coherent and integrated picture of the interactions between the participants in the economy. I'm not going to say that again, but it's a way of looking at all the transactions, the sectors, all the things that are going on, the financial flows that underpin everything. So it's a bit wordy. One thing about national accountants, we tend to use our own language. We have it's very jargon heavy, so if you look at our publications, you'll see, you think, what on earth is that? And even where economists look at it, and they say, well, I think I know what that is, but you're using totally different terms for it. But we have reasons for that. Defined by international standards. The names, the terms, the processes we do. There's a thing called the System of National Accounts, which is a United Nations publication, produced in conjunction with the World Bank, the IMF, the OECD, and also the European Commission, which covers all UN member states. And then there's a much more detailed version, which is what we live and die by, the European System of Accounts. And that is covered by EU regulation. So it's much more detailed, and that's everything we have to do. It's updated every so often, because economies change and the way the world works moves on. So, before we go into detail about talking about the actual things we produce, we've got some of the things they're used for. Well, clearly policymakers use them for economic monitoring, be that well, not just for economic monitoring, but also policy making, so setting the budget. The Office for Budget Responsibility uses them as well. The Monetary Policy Committee of the Bank of England takes an awful lot of data in. It's not all our stuff, and it's not all national accounts, but they do take a lot in, and that's used for the monthly decision on interest rates, and also for quantitative easing as well. Forecasting done in all sorts of places, city analysts, the OBR, academia, lots of stuff goes in there. We don't do forecasting at all. Our job is to say, this is our best estimate of what's happened already, without other people then say, this is what we think is going to happen next. But we don't get into that game. Various industries will use it for benchmarking, because we publish a lot of stuff at an industrial level. So if the GDP numbers came out today, we'll have stuff on agriculture, construction, manufacturing, various components of services. So people can have a look and see how they're doing against others. So we can make investment decisions. So many of our key publications are what we call market sensitive. So the GDP numbers come out, you'll see an effect on the foreign exchange rate, share prices, and so on. Which is why we're so very, very careful about what we do.
Trading yourself or something like that.
There are people within the ONS who are. Those of us who work in national accounts don't actually see the individual company returns. But clearly, if, for example, I was working on a retail sales inquiry and I suddenly started selling or buying retail shares the day before. So, personally, no, I'm not, but there are people in the organisation who are. But if I did start trading in things, bearing in mind that I know what the GDP numbers are weeks in advance, well, not weeks in advance, but from the time they're complete, I know what the UK trade balance is going to be before it's published. So, yeah, it would be. I don't. But it is something that's very carefully looked at. Here's an interesting one. Stuff that comes out of national accounts that's the largest contribution to the EU budget. There are 4 ways the EU is funded. They're called the first, second, third and fourth resources. Really exciting names. The first 2 relate to import duties. The third one relates to VAT, or its equivalent in various member states. The fourth one, which for us is the biggest one, is related directly to one particular national accounts aggregate, which I'll talk about a bit more later. To give you an indication of all the money we paid to the EU in 2011, about 11 billion out of around about 19 billion was related to this national accounts aggregate, so it's the lion's share. But also there's money coming back the other way. I'll talk a bit about regional accounts later, and certain regions of the EU receive things called structural funds, and again that's related to national accounts data directly, a job I used to do a few years ago. Okay, so look at some of the key statistics. GDP. If I asked anybody to name one national account statistics, that's the ones that will be named undoubtedly. Gross national income is another one, related to GDP but not the same. That's the one that sets the contribution to the EU budget. We'll come back to it. The household saving ratio. I'm going to talk about some of these in more detail, not all of them, but this is one we publish every 3 months. Alongside that, we publish something called real household disposable income, so people talk about a squeeze on households. One of the key indicators for that will be this one. The balance of trade I've mentioned, so it's monthly. The balance of payments, which is different. Well, one of the things that the UK has an advantage is our balance of payments stats are completely integrated with the rest of national accounts because they're done by the same people at the same time, whereas in most countries the balance of payments data are done by the central bank. Excuse me. So you have, I think it should be a mirror image of each other, and they've got a slight discrepancy. Fairly high profile at the moment. Public sector net borrowing. That's us. Actually, that's one of the few publications we do as a joint publication with another department. So it's the public sector finances jointly between ONS and HM Treasury. Short-term indicators, the indices of production, construction and services. The index of services were published today alongside the GDP data. And there's more. Net lending and borrowing by sector. About that. I mentioned the regional gross value added, regional gross disposable household income. I'll talk a bit more about them later. So it's looking at business investment, which is part of GDP, all of it. And things like the net rate of return for UK private non-financial corporations. There are loads of others. We publish thousands and thousands of series of various things, many of which are supplied to the EU, but not all of them. Okay, so GDP is the highest profile statistic, and it is the primary indicator of economic activity within any nation. But it's very important with GDP also to say what it isn't. It is not an estimate of wealth or well-being. I saw an economist on Sky News this morning, before the paper published, saying, yeah, but GDP isn't very good for measuring wealth or well-being. That's a fair comment, but that's a bit like saying that Aston Martin isn't very good as a JCB. It's not supposed to be. That's not what it is. It is an estimate of activity. There are other things where you can measure wealth, and well-being is particularly high profile. We've got a programme going to measure national well-being, but that's not about GDP. Another thing, it does not equal national accounts. National accounts is much bigger than GDP. There tends to be a perception that, oh, that's what GDP is national accounts. Same thing. They're not. So it's also the indicator of the size of an economy as well as the change. So we tend to talk about the change, but it also says the size. Right. There are 3 ways of estimating GDP. Some people tell you there are 3 measures of GDP. It's not true. There's one, but they can be calculated in 3 ways. By production, so everything that's produced within an economy. Income, the income that's generated directly by that production. And expenditure, so that's the expenditure on that production. But they are all mathematically equal. There is just one GDP. Many years ago, we used to publish 3 different estimates. Actually, we used to publish 4 because we used to publish an average. We don't anymore. There was a particular incident a few years ago, I'm going back 25 years now, where they really did diverge, and there was a time when the Bank of England wasn't independent and interest rates were set by chancellors, and coming up to just before an election when you've got the approaches diverging, it can get risky. They could pick the wrong one. So we don't do that, we just publish one estimate of GDP. So the production approach, this is a bit mathematical, but so it's, in its essence, it's everything that's produced within an economy or output as we call it, less everything you've used up to produce it. So your raw materials, your electricity, advertising, legal services, accountancy services, whatever it might be. And that bit down to there, so it's up there, that's what we call gross value added. It's very similar to GDP, it's just it's a valuation difference. To get from GVA to GDP, we add on taxes on products, so things like VAT, excise duties on alcohol, tobacco, petrol, and so forth. And we take off subsidies on products. Alex?
I read somewhere there's the document the ONS produced on the value of the financial sector or something like that, and it uses GVA. There was an explanation that it uses GVA because looking at its GDP proportion wasn't going to be an accurate representation.
Right. Well,
it has to be expanded.
Yes, certainly. When we're producing the production approach by industry, okay, so on an annual level we've got output by industry, by intermediate consumption by industry. On a quarterly level we've got output by industry. We haven't got these by industry. We don't publish GDP by industry, we publish it by sector, but we publish gross value added by industry. So if we're talking about proportions of the whole economy to be it financial services, be it agriculture, be it construction, whatever, we'll always be talking about proportions of gross value added.
Is there a reason why you don't publish that?
We don't have it. If we get the VAT data, we've got VAT by product, so the VAT paid on petrol or on cigarettes or on whatever else it might be, but we haven't got it VAT paid by the hotels industry or the retail industry or whatever else. And as simple as that, we haven't got the data to do it that way. Comment at the bottom there, in the UK, growth in output sets the quarterly growth of GDP. I said there are three ways of approaching GDP. They're mathematically equal, and if you want me to get geeky, I could prove it, but I'm not proposing to. Because we're using statistical surveys and admin data and so forth, in practice they don't come out as equal. In the UK we have far more data in the short term on output. Loads of monthly data, monthly surveys and so on. Expenditure, we've got some quarterly data, but a lot of, but some of it's annual. And income, most of our main data sources are annual. So in the short term, output sets quarterly growth. That's not true in every country. Some will base it more on expenditure, some will base it more on output. It's very, very rare that anyone will base it on income.
Could you, in the previous slide, with regards to the output, is that adjusted for currency fluctuations? So is it like mark to market?
In terms of what for the
I think you mentioned output minus the intermediate consumption. So output.
Right.
How's that measured? I mean, is that adjusted for forex fluctuations?
Well, I mean, this is everything that's produced domestically, so it's got value in sterling. There's two types of output really. There's market output, which is in a sense the easier one. So that's stuff that corporations do, and output is really sales plus changes in stocks. Okay, so everything that's, in fact, anything that's produced in a period. For non-market producers like government and charities, it's a lot more difficult. So we take proxy methods, and basically we're saying that it's the costs of producing it. So it's your staff costs, your procurement costs, and your depreciation charges. None of which are output, but they're the way that you have to try and value something that has no market value because there's no market for it. So, the income approach. So, as I said, it's all income that's directly generated by production. So it's not things like investment income and so forth. Okay, more terminology, compensation of employees, which is all of employment income. So it's wages and salaries, pension contributions, employers' pension contributions, bonuses, overtime payments, income in kind, and the like. Operating surplus and profits and rental income is a combination of the two. Mixed income is income from self-employment, so it's the first two purely for the self-employed in effect, so we don't try to split them out. And then we have taxes on production and products, so bringing in things like business rates, vehicle excise duty paid by producers as opposed to households, and then we take off subsidies on production products. Again, it's just to get them all on a consistent valuation basis. We estimate GDP at market prices, at the price paid by the end user. The third approach is the expenditure approach. So it's the sum of all final expenditures. So I mentioned that intermediate consumption, the stuff that's used up. It's not that. So, there's household final consumption, including charities. charities is a slightly misnomer. When I talk about the sectors, I'll give it its proper national accounts names. Laborious. Government consumption, we call gross capital formation. So that's all your fixed assets, so your machinery, your buildings, your production lines, computer systems, fleets of company cars, and so forth. Stuff you put into stock, be that materials and fuel, be it finished goods, be it work in progress, and valuables. So the Picasso for the chief exec's office and things like that, which don't actually produce anything, but it's a store of value. Plus the exports of goods, less import. Exports of goods and services, less imports of goods and services. Imports are subtracted because there are some included in all of the top ones. Imported. I always put that little bit at the bottom because when you've studied economics, will have seen that equation, Y equals C plus G plus I equals X plus N. Consumers expenditure, government consumption, investment, exports less imports. It's exactly the same thing, just written in national accounts speak. Quite often doing training courses for economists, suddenly the penny drops at this point. Oh, I've seen that before somewhere. I don't know. It's the same thing. I don't know what Y should stand for GDP, but it does. Okay. Okay. So I said it describes the size of the economy, relatively, so you can look at which are the biggest economies in the EU or worldwide, both in terms of absolute levels and also in change over time. So we tend to focus on the growth or decline in GDP. So rather than people talking about the size of the economy today, they're talking about it's grown by 1% compared with quarter 2, and it's flat compared with quarter 3 of last year. It doesn't describe where the money ends up, so it's not an estimate of wealth. So when people say, I mentioned that poor economist on Sky this morning, the august figure of Jeremy Paxman in the course of University Challenge. Somebody gave GDP as a wrong answer. He said, no, that's total wealth. He should have known better. Gross national income. What I mentioned. Some of you may have heard the term gross national product. You may not. That's the old name for this. To national accountants, GNP is a term that's 15 years redundant. We haven't used it at all. But it's still very commonly used outside. So what is it? This is the one that sets the largest share of our contribution to the EU budget. Okay. Right. It is described as GDP plus net property income from abroad. Don't be fooled by the name property income. It's not what you might think, I suspect. But I suspect you're sitting there thinking that's something to do with buildings, bricks and mortar, ownership of buildings. That's not what that is. It's a daft name, to be honest, I have to say. Nothing to do with buildings. Income from land, which is a small part. So things like loans and deposits. In other words, it's interest. And corporations, so it's dividends, repatriated profits, partnership share outs, things like that. So it's ownership of financial assets, but it's nothing to do with what you might think of as property in terms of ownership of buildings.
Why don't you use the term assets abroad?
It's one of these things we've got. The terms are set by those international manuals I described. And I gave a presentation to the National Statistician a few days ago, and I said if I ever get the chance to go on an international expert group for the next update of a system of national accounts, I'm going to plead to change this name, because it is misleading. Some of the things we've got are quite intuitive, but property income is a very, very odd name. I think one of the things economists used to describe it as is IPD, interest, profits, dividends. It's pretty close, but it's certainly a better name than property income. I suspect that in other languages it works better, but certainly for the English-speaking world it's a poor name. So, but a percentage of this is used to set our fourth resource. It's not really an estimate of wealth, but it's better than GDP for that. Because give some examples. Obvious examples, Southeast Asia, you've got all these factories producing trainers and things for multinational corporations. Huge amounts of activity going on, so GDP is very high, but then the money is going back out to the parent companies in Western Europe, or the United States, or Japan, or wherever it might be. So their GNI, in effect, will be much lower. Within the, I think most, this is sort of developed Western economies, GNI is a little bit higher than GDP. For us, in 2011, it was about 1% higher. The two member states of the EU where it's significantly lower, or has been over a long period of time. One is the Republic of Ireland, where before all the crisis and so on, GDP was pretty high, but a lot of it is owned by American banks, so the money was only going back out to the States. The other one is Luxembourg, where again, lots of it is owned by German banks. Although that said, Luxembourg still has a very, very high GNI for the size of country it is. So this is why this is the one that's used to set the contributions to the EU budget rather than GDP. That's it, 1% higher than GDP.
Is that why they keep trying to get companies to move to Ireland with all those tax incentives and stuff like that?
Well, I mean, I think that's more to do with corporate policy. I mean, they're not too worried about GNI, GDP issues, but certainly multinational companies will try to minimise their tax burdens, and they'll take account of other legislation and so forth in various countries as to where they locate different bits of their businesses. Multinationals are tricky for national accountants to deal with. You have things flowing around within those corporations, but there might be a call centre in India, they might have an insurance arm in the UK, they might have a retail arm in Canada, a production unit in, I don't know, Malaysia or something. And you're trying to work out which bits we need to pick up and which bits we don't need to pick up. That's one of our most complicated issues over the next few years. Okay, I mentioned sectors. One of the things that most people, when talking about sectors, are talking about industries. National accountants don't. We mean something different. We break the economy down into 6 sectors and numerous sub-sectors. Non-financial corporations, financial corporations, general government, households, the delightfully named non-profit institutions serving households. Basically, they're organisations which don't produce goods or services for the market and are not controlled by government. So it's things like charities, trade unions, political organisations, other membership organisations. It does actually include, in the UK, unusually, private schools because of their charitable status. It includes most of our universities as well.
Would include the Fabians Society.
It will include the Fabians Society, definitely. That's where you would be. Yes, the entire sweep of political parties are in there, from the Socialist Workers right through to the British National Party. They're all in there. And the rest of the world. Okay. When we talk about the rest of the world, we don't really mean the rest of the world. We mean the bits of the rest of the world that interact with our people. Okay, why am I telling you this? Because we have to classify any new unit, organisation that's set up needs to be classified in one of these sectors so we can put it in the right place in the accounts. And one of the things I wanted to get across is that this is purely an ONS decision. We have a thing called the National Accounts Classification Committee, which operates in line with international guidance and decides where things are classified. A lot of them are perfectly straightforward. It's usually pretty obvious if something is, if it's a government department, for example, or if it's a non-financial corporation. But there's a public-private split within non-financial corporations, which can get interesting. So, based on two things: type of activity, do they produce goods and services for the market, and control of general corporate policy is the other phrase we use. And that's a fairly vague term, which we have to look at things on a case-by-case basis, and it can be very, very controversial. The most famous example is Network Rail, which is classed as a private non-financial corporation. The fact that it has its debts underwritten by government doesn't make it a public corporation. That was very controversial at the time. It does rumble on from time to time that people think it should be within the public sector. International guidance is that we put it in the right place. Okay, so we've got these sectors. We produce accounts for all of these sectors and many of the sub-sectors, which I haven't gone into detail on. Right, household saving ratio. What is the saving ratio? It's one. It comes out every 3 months, and it is the percentage of household disposable income which is left after consumption expenditure. And it's a key indicator. Some economists will tell you that if that starts going up, it can be an indicator of difficult times ahead. People think, worry about my job, worry about my income, so on, won't spend as much. It's not quite as linear as that because sometimes you can't help having to spend. At the moment, ours is around about 6.5%, 6.6%.
Is this quarterly?
This is quarterly, yeah. Yeah.
And this is last quarter, or is it a quarter previous?
The latest data we published are for the second quarter. We'll publish the third quarter saving ratio on the 21st of December. So ours is around about 6.6%, which is quite normal for us. But if you look at the EU average, it's something like 12 or 13%. They tend to save more than we do, and that's historically true. Japanese save even more, the Americans save even less.
How do you include credit in that? If someone has a credit card, for example, and starts paying, how does that...
Right. The actual level of people's debt doesn't affect this. Okay. Various things that will feed into it. On the income side will be wage and salaries, benefits, pensions, and so on. Going out, you would have also insurance claims will be in there. But going out, you would have taxes, pension contributions, your final consumption expenditure, any property income you're paying, so any interest you're paying, the interest you're receiving will be in there. So the fact that you're paying interest on a credit card, for example, that will be taken account of there. The actual level of your credit card debt or your mortgage or whatever else it might be doesn't directly affect that, but clearly it might affect the decisions that you make regarding consumption expenditure. If you think, well, I've got an awful lot of debt I need to clear, I'm not going to go and buy that holiday or that car or whatever.
Does this mean that two households could have the same household saving ratio, one could be have a lot more debt?
Yes.
Not
Yes.
comparable.
Because these look at sort of 1 quarter, and clearly things that have happened over a period of months, quarters, years will affect the decisions that are taken in that quarter, but these are looking at specific quarters. But we do publish a whole time series so you can see how they move over time. Hi.
How do you work out which bank accounts are connected to which household?
Okay.
How is that possible?
Household sector is one of the hardest to actually get data on. Because when we run our business surveys, they're compulsory. Okay. Household surveys are not compulsory. We don't. So many of the transactions within the household that to do with households, not all of them, but some of them, particularly further down the accounts, we work them from the opposite side. If we know that, for example, banks are paying interest to households, because we get lots of data, particularly from the Bank of England, on the entire banking industry. So we know where the interests come from. We know how much has gone to corporations, because we've got stuff from surveys. So we've got a pretty good idea that most of the rest of it has gone to households. So a lot of it is done on what we call a counterpart basis. So the two sectors where that affects most of the rest of the world and the household sector. But it's generally accepted that households are more difficult to estimate than others. So you quite often do it from the other side of the transaction. So, for example, some of household expenditure is estimated using the retail sales inquiry, which is a business survey. Not all of it. It's about 2/5 of it, I think. Real household disposable income, which is one that's been quite high profile in the last 18 months or so. This is household disposable income adjusted to take away the effects of inflation. So one of the things we saw in 2011, we saw the biggest fall since 1977. And the first fall since I think it was 1982 or 1981. So this has become a lot more high profile than it was a couple of years ago. One of the things that used to be a real big headline grabber, but much less frequent now, the current account balance and the balance of payments. So that's our financial flows to and from the rest of the world, including, as I say, imports and exports of goods and services, which is the balance of trade, any investment income going in either direction, so ownership of foreign corporations and vice versa, property income, so again that's the interest and the dividends and the repatriated profits and so forth, employment income, we have cross-border workers, and transfers, so that's all the rest of it. So things like remittances, where people are sending money back to family members in other parts of the world and all these kinds of things. So the current account balance shows that. The famous occasion, go back to 1970, the balance of payments figures came out just before the election. They were particularly dreadful because we just imported 2 jumbo jets. And the Prime Minister at the time then later said that that cost him the election. The balance of payments was so much more high profile then. But that was Harold Wilson in case you wonder. Okay, some more of them. Net lending and borrowing by sector. Some of the national accounts names aren't necessarily intuitive. If after you've carried out all your expenditures and received all your incomes, you have money left, as a sector you are deemed to be a lender to the economy. If you don't have any money left, or if you've got a shortfall, you're deemed to be a borrower from the economy. For the public sector as a whole, and I didn't mention the public sector, so general government, public corporations, plus the publicly owned banks, that is the deficit, what we're talking about at the moment, isn't it? So that is a key figure. We also tend to talk about net lending and borrowing a lot for the non-financial corporations, to an extent for the financial corporations. But all these are flows. Alongside that you've got levels, so the other one that goes alongside the public sector net borrowing is the public sector net debt, which is the actual amount of debt the UK public sector has, which I should say is not the same as the national debt. We don't tend to talk very much about the national debt. That's purely central government debt. There's a term that dates back to the 18th century when there was only central government. We really had public corporations and local government. So the national debt is central government, but the public sector net debt is the one we tend to talk about. Okay, there are thousands of other stats within the sector accounts. We have a thing called the short-term output indicators. The main ones being the retail sales index, which is very, very high profile in its own right. The index of production, which deals with manufacturing industry, mining and quarrying, and the utility, so energy supply. And the index of services, which covers all the services industries. And they deal with monthly changes in productive activity, monthly changes in output. They do feed directly into the production approach to GDP. But they give a very quick estimate, particularly retail sales and IOP. iOS is a little bit slower. Regional accounts, and not everything is done at a UK level. Well, I should mention retail sales, for example, is GB only. It doesn't include Northern Ireland. Regional accounts, they're produced at 3 levels of geographical disaggregation. They're called NUTS levels. Okay? It's an EU term. It stands for the nomenclature units of territorial statistics. It's a really punchy names we come up with. Okay. Because regional accounts are deemed to be a regional specification of the national accounts. There are some things you can't do regionally because they don't make sense regionally. Loans and deposits, for example. You go and put money in your local branch of your bank, your Barclays Bank, for example. Is that in London? Is it even in the UK? I mean, it probably is in the UK, but actually I identify where, because you can go and draw it out from a branch in Aberdeen. So, the 3 levels. NUTS 1. So it's the 9 English regions, formerly the government office regions as they were called. And then Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. We don't actually have any legal requirement to produce data at NUTS 1 level. Because the EU doesn't really care about it. But in fact, domestically it's probably our most important one. Because you've got the devolved administration in particular. We used to have the regional development agencies, and the government office regions were very, very interested. Most important one is the NUTS 2 level. We have 37 sub-regions, and there's 139 local areas at NUTS 3. Those are the 2 that are covered by EU regulation. What do we produce? Gross value added, so I said that's the thing close to GDP, but valued slightly differently, and gross disposable household income. There's no quarterly data there. Okay, so the sub-regional and the local area GVA data, and in fact the GDHI, well not GDHI, sorry, they're converted into GDP and then put on a per head basis. The per heads are important because they're interested in one particular thing. And for those sub-regions whose GDP per head, with purchasing powers, so taking account different pricing levels in different countries, is less than 75% of the EU average over a given 3-year period, EU structural funds were provided over a 7-year period. And it's quite a lot of money. And we've got 2 in the UK. One is West Wales and the Valleys, and one is Cornwall and the Isles of Scilly.
Where does the money actually go? To government there?
Well, it comes via central government and then gets allocated. So if you go around certain parts of West Wales and other parts of the EU, you'll suddenly see these big placards saying this is funded by EU structural funds. I've just come back from Greece and there's a few of them there. Now, you might think that this is dominated by the Eastern European countries, the new member states, and it is. And we thought that we'll probably lose the structural funding there. But the data we supplied in December last year happened to be the one that was the data that were for this funding round, and it covered the period up to 2009. And of course, at the time of the financial crisis, everything went downhill. So they're still below the 75% of the EU average, despite the fact you have regions in Bulgaria, Romania, and so on that are something like 25% of the EU average. The highest by a mile is in London, highest across the EU. It's something like 340% of the EU average. Not surprisingly, it includes the city. Okay, data collection and publication processes. We have huge numbers of data sources feeding into the national accounts, some of which are surveys and some of which are administrative data collected by other people. Some of our key surveys, these are ONS ones. So the monthly business survey, which is basically a turnover survey, covers the manufacturing industry, construction and large chunks of services. The annual business survey, which is a very, very detailed survey covering all sorts, covering turnover, employment, purchases, capital expenditure, etc., 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 a very detailed level. The retail sales inquiry, what it says. The living costs and food survey is slightly different. It's a household budget survey, in effect. It goes out to people and gives them a diary for 2 weeks to ask them to fill in everything they spend, in effect. And that feeds into household expenditure.
How many people do you do in the sample?
I'm trying to think how big the sample is now. I think it's something like 16,000. It was 16,000, it may have been, because there have been various cuts over the years. It used to be 16,000. The quarterly profits inquiry goes to about 1,600 companies to give an indicative level of, indicative figure for changes in profits over time. And the quarterly capital expenditure survey, what it says is looking at capital purchases by corporations. Okay. We also get that from various other places. So other government departments, so revenue and customs, most of our income data come from revenue and customs. Government expenditure data mainly come from the Treasury and communities and local government. And we have most of our agriculture data come from DEFRA. Financial Services Authority give us data on the insurance industry particularly. But also other admin data. The Bank of England, most of the data we get on banks comes from the Bank of England. They're collecting it anyway, so they give it to us. We also get some data from the Association of British Insurers, not as much as we used to. Now we're using a lot more FSA data.
Why did you emphasise on the insurance industry when you said what FSA gives you?
That's basically what we've only recently started using their data. We improved the measurement of the insurance industry this year, and one of the improvements we made, that partly was conceptual and partly it was improved data sources. That improved data, the main improved data source was FSA, which we weren't using before. It's their admin data. Right. How does the survey? Oh, Alex.
Does it take into account capital analysis?
Not on the quarterly CapEx survey, no. That's what we find is the monthly surveys have got fewer questions than the quarterly surveys. The quarterly surveys have got fewer than the annual surveys. So those kind of things wouldn't be in there. It will be say how much have you spent on or disposed of vehicle, ships and aircraft, plant and machinery, buildings, dwellings, other buildings and structures and things like that, rather than how was it funded. Okay, so the survey process, when we get the survey forms back, we scan them into our ONS systems. We have automatic validation, so we go back and check with responders if the numbers look funny. So if every month they're saying, oh, our turnover is £10,000, £10,000, £15,000, £17,000, £750,000, that doesn't look right, and we'll flag it up, and our business data division will then get in touch with the relevant people. And we also chase non-response. As I said, we have a power of legal enforcement.
Do you talk to HMRC if someone starts, a business makes a huge gain and it gets confirms it, and they
No.
may not have that tax?
No, our business surveys are covered by a thing called the Statistics of Trade Act 1947, which basically says, yes, we can force companies to comply. We have to tell them what the data are being used for, a compilation of national accounts, or whatever else it might be, and we also have a duty of confidentiality. So we can't give out individual company information to anyone.
Has there ever been a case where it might have been suspected that industry might have sort of colluded to influence their statistics?
I'm not aware of one.
Okay.
I'm not aware of one. Interesting
So
thought.
what would you do in that sort of situation? Do you have any powers to flag it up, or do you just have to sit with it?
If we were sending out a turnover form and suddenly it got this massive spike and we checked it out with them and they said, yep, that's genuine, we wouldn't have any way of knowing whether their tax payments were going in the same direction because we wouldn't be asking them that question. So, we couldn't say anything to HMRC if we think this company's not paying what it should because we wouldn't know. It's that simple. We aggregate them, we gross them to the whole population they represent because it's a representative sample. And then it gets applied into our national accounts compiler, so the people who produce the capital formation estimates, household expenditure, and so forth. Okay. So they combine them as necessary to whatever level we need. Again, they might go back and query the data as well, so it's sort of to and fro process. Then we have to deflate them to get volume estimates. We seasonally adjust them as appropriate. It's all very well saying, yeah, retail sales went up in December. Yeah, okay. Thanks. That's not overly helpful. But, we produce seasonally adjusted and non-seasonally adjusted estimates. And they produce the various aggregates and then supply them in to the coordinators, people like me. Okay, so what do we do? Okay, we balance them. Okay. GDP and the sector accounts are all balanced. Certain things have to equal certain things. There is only one GDP, although the estimates that come through will give you different answers. We talk to the compilers, but we also, it's a highly collegiate process, and we balance them. GDP is balanced in different ways for the quarterly and annual processes, and that's based on the data we have and the processes we use. And we publish on the web to a pre-announced timetable. The quarterly process, we basically say, there's the output estimate, and we balance the other two approaches to it. And we publish the adjustments we have to put in to do that. Call them alignment adjustments, and you'll see them in our publications. On the annual basis, we have things called supply and use tables, which balance things at a much more detailed level, and we end up with no discrepancies. Okay, so what do we publish? Today, preliminary estimate of GDP, only based on the output data, and published 3.5 weeks after the end of the quarter. I used to be able to say we were the fastest in the world, but we're not anymore. The People's Republic of China beats us. We're still one of the quickest. 4 weeks later, we published the second estimate. That does include some expenditure and income data. So you'll see aggregates for household expenditure, government consumption, GFCF, compensation of employees, and so on. And then 4 weeks later, we publish the quarterly national accounts. It's usually 4 weeks later. The next one coming will be less than that because it's December, so we have to publish a bit earlier. Otherwise, we'll be publishing just after Christmas, so we publish just before. Then we've got a lot of detail on all three approaches, and all the sector accounts get published. So that's when you see the saving ratio, real household disposable income, and all the other things. While this is all going on, we've got all the monthly indicators coming along. So retail sales, index of production, balance of trade, all these are published on a monthly basis, public sector finances and the like. And on the annual, we have the flagship publications, the Blue Book for National Accounts and the Pink Book for Balance of Payments. They used to be books, and they used to be blue and pink. And now it's all web-based, of course. But what do? So we get all our big annual data sources, so things like HMRC income data, our annual business survey. We have the full annual balancing I just mentioned, where we're balancing at a far more detailed level. Any methodological changes that we're bringing in, improved data sources, conceptual improvements and the like. Sometimes the accounting framework change. I mentioned ISA 95, okay, 17 years old. There is an ISA 2010. That will be implemented in 2 years' time in the Blue Book. Industrial classifications. We have a thing called the Standard Industrial Classification, which is updated every few years. In 2011, we introduced the 2007 classification. Product classifications. The classification of products by activity, the CPA. Again, last year we introduced the 2008 product classification. They all come in the Blue Book process, and it'll be published in July or October. But the actual production process takes longer than a year on each of these. So it's going all the time. We're publishing these quarterly publications. So there's two things going at any given time.
So I'll show everyone if you want to see what it looks like. It's the front cover for PDF.
I think you just touched something because that's not Blue Book.
That's not it. Oh, that's what I meant.
That's Blue Book.
That's the Blue Book. So you can get this on the website.
It is on the website, yeah. The next one will be published in July 2013. It does take at least a year. Okay, one of the things you asked me to mention was how you find our stuff and who to get in touch with. Okay, web address. Okay, so we launched a new website in August last year. It's safe to say it had teething troubles, giving away any office secrets there. We dealt with an awful lot of them. You can search it by theme, so economy, social stats, and the like. You can search it by publications, and you can search it by data sets. So rather than looking at a stats bulletin or something, you can actually just look at the detailed data sets that underpin. And all the things we publish since the new website came in, and this is an improvement, as well as having PDF files, we've got Excel tables for everything. The last two things that haven't got Excel tables are Blue Book and Pink Book, and they'll happen next year. So you can just take it over in a much more usable format. That's one of the clear improvements on the new website. Some things were published with Excel tables before, but most weren't. But you can also download time series data sets, and you can sort of cherry pick the series you want, the time periods you want, periodicities you want, and you can pull them out into Excel and do what you like with them. Okay, but there are other ways. We have a customer contact centre. Numbers there, so I'll circulate these slides. And that's also got an email address. Specifically for national accounts, we have a GDP inbox. Okay, so even if it's not a GDP query, there are other inboxes within national accounts, but if it goes into that one, we'll make sure it goes to the right people. Okay. That's running my team. And the other thing that you asked me to mention, Alex, was the interpretation of things where things may not seem to stack up with each other. We're not the only people who produce economic statistics. Okay? Lots of other people do it. That's fine. One thing I won't do is comment on other people's statistics. I'm not going to do that. So, but there's certain things you can look at. Is the producer independent? We're not the only independent producer. There are others. But there are also stats that are produced for particular reasons. They may be lobby groups, they may be industry groups who are trying to get certain things done, trying to get a certain message across. It's the one that really, if they're surveys, think about the sample sizes. Just to give you an indication, the monthly business survey of ours got 44,000 respondents. Retail sales, 5,000. I mentioned the annual business survey, it's over 80,000. Not all surveys may be that big. So, are they quantitative or qualitative? All of ours, apart from well-being, which is slightly different, certainly anything that feeds into national accounts will be quantitative. What was your turnover? What's your employment? What were your purchases? Actual values. Some other surveys will be, hey, do you think last quarter was better or worse than the one before? And that's fine. But then we just get an average of, well, 55% said it was better, 45% said it was worse, so it's better. It could be the 55% were the ones that are actually quite small, possibly. Might not necessarily be the case, but where we would say, well, actually, yeah, we've got all these ones going up, but them all added together could be smaller than this one that's going down because it's such a dominant player in that industry. So they can give you different results. A lot of external surveys are actually forward-looking. Okay, what do you think is going to happen? Well, we don't do any of those. everything we say, what happened that quarter, that month, that year. Definitions. What some people describe certain things as will not necessarily be the same as we would define as. All of ours are based around the European system of accounts, so internationally defined. Other people use different definitions, and that's fine. That's not a criticism, but you may end up with two publications which look like they're describing the same thing, but in fact they might not be. Or it may be a key difference.
We can find definitions on the website.
Certainly, well, for ESA, certainly. ESA is published on the Eurostat website, but we've also got published on the ONS website a thing called A Short Guide to the National Accounts, which, because ESA is about that thick, and it's very, very, because it's a legal text as well as anything else, so it's very, it's quite heavy going. But the short guide is about 40 pages, and it gives the definition of the key national accounts components. And also talks about the publication schedule and things like that. But these can be pitfalls. You look at things and think, well, actually, they're the same. Well, they might be similar, but they're not necessarily the same. And that was all I was going to cover. Any more questions?
Any questions to you?
I think we've said quite a lot of them as we've been going along.
That's fine.
Just one other one, I suppose, is CPI is EU
Yes.
tax, isn't it?
Yes.
RPI was sort of our...
That was our one. Long predates the CPI, yeah.
The basket, that's your remit to decide what's
Yes.
in the basket. How do you go about working out what's in the basket, and how do you adjust it? Do you do this and always relate talk to the UK authority about doing it, or do you do this off your own back?
It is an ONS decision, and it is based on purchases, on the scale of purchases by households over a certain level. If they're over a certain level, then they'll get in the basket. So at the beginning of every year, you'll see we'll put out a publication saying the basket's changed. These are the items that have come in: iPods, iPhones, etc. These are the things that have gone out: pipe, tobacco, etc. For example, there's various things that go out, and we quite often get a bit of letter in the press discussed at Tunbridge Wells. I don't use iPhones. I don't drink cafe latte. And it does happen. Where's the pipe tobacco gone? Where's the gin gone? For example, it could be all these kinds of things, because it's supposed to be a representative basket for the population of the UK. Now, clearly, there is no Mr. or Mrs. Average, so some people will think that doesn't represent anything like I do. But the basket is our remit for the RPI and the CPI.
Related to that, we consider thousands of different statistics that make up the national accounts. Does it require a political will for you to have a demand, effectively, for you to produce certain statistics, or a new type of measure, or, for example, if regional-based RPI, for example, would that be, would the government have to ask you for it, or would that be something?
Right. I mean, the easiest, not necessarily the easiest, but one thing that will guarantee that we're going to produce it is a legal requirement. Most of our legal requirements in terms of national accounts are EU. Most of them. Not all of them, but most of them. Clearly, if our users are saying we want this, we have a statistical work programme which runs over a period of years, and we put that out to consultation. So the things that our users really want and ask for, depending on, of course, on resources. Now, regional RPI you mentioned, we get, I forget the number, it's an enormous number of price quotations every month for the RPI, CPI. We'd need to multiply that by 12 to do a regional one. And it has been looked at in the past, in times when resources were more readily available and the cost was still prohibitive. So there would need, will is one thing, money would be another. Certain things just cost a fortune. But we do change things as time goes on. Clearly we have a new European system of accounts coming through. We'll have to implement that. Not optional. There are, clearly, governments change, policies change, and if there is a requirement for monitoring certain policies and the statistics don't exist, then there's a good chance that we're going to have to produce them. And well-being was mentioned. It was partly a new agenda with a new government, but it was also internationally there was a thing called the Stiglitz report, which pushing in that direction as well. So it wasn't a completely new thing for us. What it meant was we had funding for it because there was political will for it.
Have you published your happiness index?
We have published various wellbeing indicators.
Sorry.
I get told off if I call it happiness. You're allowed to. So I'm not allowed to. But we have published quite a lot of different, because it's looking at lots of different things. Clearly, some of them are subjective, some are objective. The subjective ones are harder to get a handle on, because if, for example, if you said how happy are you, for example, well, some people might be happy with, as long as they've got a roof over their head and enough food to eat, they'll be happy. Some people will say, well, no, I want a sports car and 3 foreign holidays a year, so I haven't got that, so I'm not happy. So that's where it becomes difficult, and we've got a whole team in the ONS just looking at how we do subjective wellbeing and other parts of wellbeing. We've got the environmental accounts, which are a bit of a bridge really between wellbeing and national accounts, because it looks at greenhouse gas emissions and waste, various and oil and gas reserves and material use and various other things. They've been going a lot longer than the wellbeing, right, but they sit quite nicely with it. But they're also what we call a satellite to the national accounts. So we do try to keep things as broad as possible, and that's an area that is expanding, environmental accounts over the years.
How do you put to use your wellbeing index? Meaning, just wondering if you could help us with some examples of how does that come into play in decision making? I would imagine, because yours is a very quantitative focused organisation, and when it comes to qualitative.
Well, yeah, I mean, as I say, we tended not to do much in many things that are subjective in the past, because national accounts, we've got the definitions, prices, labour market, population, all these kinds of things. Suddenly look at something that's purely subjective, and it's different. It's markedly different, but there is a policy requirement for it. Now, in terms of how that's used, that's really a question for the policy departments. But what is required, we put out a large consultation after it was really kicked off to look at the kinds of things that people were interested in. So we've done various things on education, on life satisfaction, various other things. And there is a survey which looks at this subjective bit. We've got a list of questions. Now, I'm not an expert on the wellbeing side. I'm working on there. But there's various things, and there have been various articles and publications popping up quite regularly. Now, then that should then feed into the policy departments that needed them or asked for them, and then how they then use them is up to them, really.
I mean, the reason why I asked was I read a similar article by a sister agency in Australia, and they had mentioned that wellbeing index may not necessarily be like the true reflection of what the population is feeling, in the sense that you would expect that when there's a GDP sort of growth decline, when it's a negative growth, that's when you would expect people to be unhappier and unsatisfied, and when it's going up, you expect, but it's sometimes the other way around. I think there was a study conducted somewhere in Melbourne, and that's why I thought it may be of use to ask.
Yeah, it's a lot more, because it's a lot more complex than that, because there are, the economy does this, but there could be other things at play. It could be something, it could be to do with health, it could be to do, suddenly health outcomes, for whatever reason, are getting better. People might be, the economy's not doing so well, but we're all healthier, that's fine. Or education standards may be going up, or crime may be falling, and all these kinds of other things which are not necessarily, could be related in some way to GDP, but not necessarily part of it. So they can sort of knock in different directions.
Yeah, but I would have assumed that there's a concept of benchmarking things and trying to, shall I say, normalize the results. So is there a way in which you tackle that?
Well, I mean,
more universally with all the indexes that you take care of.
Absolutely. I mean, in many of our publications, what we've got are international standards. And, for example, I mentioned GNI. Not only is it important, well, it's important for setting the EU budget, guess what? The EU come and check to make sure, A, we're doing what we're supposed to be doing, and B, we're doing what we tell them we're doing. Okay? Now, the key international driver on the wellbeing side is the stimulus agenda. And there's lots of work going on in places like the OECD and in Europe. And we're trying to get some sort of standards, but it's still a relatively new area. So it's developing very rapidly. But I foresee a situation where we will end up benchmarking methodology and systems and processes across certainly the EU, possibly OECD. So I say it's still a relative infancy. I mean, national accounts have been going since 1940s. Well-being is a bit younger than that.